it's just that the only way to get anything done was to break the rules.
Right. Whereas today, the common breaking the rules we see out there is to avoid accountability for when you've done something wrong, rather than just getting business done. Sometimes when you're driving down the road all by yourself, you begin to hear a voice that tells you need to look around, pay attention. Maybe something isn't quite right. That voice is me. It's the voice of Gord. Hey everybody, how's it going? Good morning, welcome back. Quick intro here for you. Had to bump this interview ahead. I've got about 5 or 6 in the holster. However, sometimes things happen online and out there in the universe, and timing is of the essence. Today's guest has been involved in a online back and forth with one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, Chris Spear of the American Trucking Association. Need I say any more? One of the things I mentioned in this interview with Craig is a previous iteration where Craig and Mr. Spear kind of went at it after Mr. Spear lobbed some grenades at Craig, and Mr. Fuller's very good at returning fire and pointing out very handily and very effectively how much better FreightWaves is than the American Trucking Association, what they've built, and basically obliterates Spear. And that generated some buzz, and I was asked by a colleague and fan of the show to get this one out the door and out to you guys just to take advantage of that. As I said, timing is of the essence. We spoke about so much else, though. Craig's got a long history in trucking. His dad was, the U.S. Express Empire. His uncle was at Covenant. Craig, was fired and went off and did his own thing and started a bunch of his own businesses and basically started FreightWaves from scratch. He's got a number of other things going on, the sonar, freight data analytics tool, and he's got this Firecrown media thing going. The dude's just one of these serial entrepreneurs, just thoughtful and very good at everything he does. He's had some excellent journalists working at FreightWaves over the years. Past guests of this show, Rachel Premack and Clarissa Haas, have done some great work for Craig. And, FreightWaves is going to be referenced fairly heavily in my book because they report on everything. And Craig's not afraid to overturn stones and see what's going on. So I think you guys will enjoy this discussion. I let Craig cook quite a bit. He does most of the talking, and he's very good at that as well. So as always, questions, comments, suggestions, corrections, and hate mail can be sent to gordylocks@protonmail.com. If you haven't already, smash the subscribe button on my Substack, autonomoustruckers.substack.com. If you're a person of means, I could really use some money, but I'm kind of unemployed for 2 years, and writing don't pay that well. Paid subscriptions are handy. Donations to the book I'm writing about the fate of the American truck driver can be made at givesendgo.com/end of the road book project. Speaking of which, manuscript is coming along nicely, should be submitted in late August, and have it published and printed and out to you guys in March of next year. Really looking forward to it. I'm deep in the thick of it now. It's going really well, and I can't wait to finish it up. It's been a fun project. I've learned a lot, and you guys are going to learn a lot too. All right, let's get to it. Mr. Craig Fuller of FreightWaves. All right, g'day everybody. Welcome back to another fantastic episode of the Voice of Gord podcast. I'm Gord, and this is my voice. The other voice you're about to hear, you may have heard elsewhere. Well-renowned gentleman in the world of trucking here in the United States of America. Long family history in it, and my guest is the owner of a media empire. And I'm kind of surprised he said yes to talking to me. So please welcome to the show, CEO of Sonar and CEO of FreightWaves and Firecrown. Everyone knows him on Twitter, Mr. Craig Fuller.
Gord, glad to be here. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming, sir. And thanks for having me down in Chattanooga for a couple of F3 parties ago. That's a good time you throw down there.
No, I appreciate it. It was fun having you down there. First time you and I met. You and I had a early on in our relationship. It was a little bit more back and forth. Glad to know that we're friends. I'm actually surprised I got the invite. So that
It took me long enough. I mean, my this show it goes at the pleasure of my life, right? Like if I've got time, if my guests have time, as you know, lots of moving parts to all this stuff. And you've been on the list for a while, and again, thank you very much for coming. And I want to get into the sort of history of FreightWaves, but first, tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and your history in trucking.
Yeah, so I grew up in trucking. My grandfather had some trucking companies during the regulated part of the market. And my dad, in 1985, my grandfather sold one of those trucking companies to a guy that was actually Roger Penske CFO. Roger Penske came in to buy my grandfather's company, a company called Southwest Motor Freight. And the CFO liked the business so much, but Roger had a bunch of stuff going on with racing and I think Detroit Diesel and et cetera. So the CFO ended up buying my grandfather's trucking company, Southwest Motor Freight, embezzled a bunch of the money. And my dad worked there and is like, peace, I'm out of here because this isn't what he signed up for. And so he went out and started US Express. And my uncle started a company called Covenant Transport. So
Oh, you're
big,
related to the Covenant guys too.
yeah, big trucking. I'm a
Oh,
big
wow.
trucking brat, Gord. So uh,
Wow.
I grew up in the industry. I definitely have diesel in my blood. And so it's an industry that I love. And if you I think, US Press is a big company. But to me, it was a family company very early on, a family business, because, my father started with, a fleet of 50 trucks when they first started. And they were actually a leased owner operator to a company called Countrywide, is how my dad got his start. It was another trucking company that my grandfather owned. And so he was able to move from the leased owner operator into a fleet. So when they first started, they didn't take all those trucks at once. They sort of bled them out of the leased owner operators. They built their company. And that was sort of how it went. And that's how he started US Express. And my uncle did that at Covenant. So.
And so US Express and Covenant, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, mostly company drivers and company equipment, correct?
That's right. Yeah, they never really moved into. They had some owner operators. So if you look at US Express, at one point there was as many as 1,000 sort of contract operators, and they had, I think, at this point maybe 4,000 company trucks, and that was maybe in the early 2000s. But it's hard for these corporate fleet operators to also have leased owner operators because the way the business models are very different. And look, we all know that there's a lot of sort of unscrupulous practices that go into the leased owned operators because you're really not your own boss. And I think largely that was US Express was not comfortable with doing some of the things that you see with some of these leased owned operator fleets that are specifically that. And I think Landstar has been very successful at it because their business is leased owned operators and they sort of have a business model that works. But it's always been hard when you have these sort of corporate fleet operations and leased owned operators because you're sort of fighting what business model makes sense. And so those businesses were sort of the thing of the past. So it's all mostly corporate fleets.
Right. So your dad's running US Express, which he started after deregulation?
1985, yeah. And so benefited from that was the days when trucking was a super high growth industry. It was, it was a great living. It was a great way to make money. Truck drivers were doing quite well. This was sort of, if there was a golden age of trucking, it was sort of that, first couple of years of deregulation were challenging because the world had to sort of figure it out. But that 1985 period to say, probably September 11th, sort of 2001, was sort of the heydays of the long haul business. And Covenant and US Express were both the leaders in the over the road long haul, that I-40 corridor, if you will. they owned it, and they both had huge team operations. It was CRST was sort of the third operator on that long haul freight, but they were the ones running long haul I-40 and I-20, and just they were definitely the market leaders, and a lot of it was team transit. A lot of team operations. Covenant US Express were both the leaders in team transit. CRST through their trainer fleet being sort of a player there as well. And that was it was the long haul business, man. That was the in the days when you could do really well. Your trucking operation would run in the low 90s, maybe high 80s OR, and it was a great business in those days. And everything changed in the 2000s. You had the introduction of freight brokerage, and intermodal really took on a lot of the long haul business. It just became a much more challenging market the last 20 years. So I grew up around that. I was 6 years old. My dad started US Express. It had a trailer. Like their office, their first terminal was a gravel parking lot in Dalton, Georgia, with a trailer. And we would go down there, and if you've been in a family business, I know you've got a family business, and anyone who's got a family business, doesn't matter the size of it. If you've got someone running it, you're going to be around it, and your kids are around it. Our family vacations were to places like Colton, California, and Laredo, Texas. I mean, it's cool if you like trucking,
Yeah.
but
So when you say family vacations, like, did you hop in a rig with the old man and go somewhere?
we did. Now, he didn't drive a truck.
I've never heard you talk about this on Twitter at all, but like, have you ever driven yourself?
I mean, look, I have driven, and you're gonna talk some shit about this, Gord, right now, because I've driven some automatic transmissions. I don't know that everyone here is gonna be like that guy. Yeah, we knew it. Your fingernails are too clean to be driving a real man's truck. I've driven the automatic transmission. I have tried to drive a stick, but all the U.S. Expresses in the last, gosh, 20 years, they were sort of the first fleet to have full automatic transmissions. I've driven an automatic transmission. I've tried a stick, but my fingernails are too clean for that. So we'll leave it to the real men. The real men can drive the stick trucks.
It
So
takes some practice. You can be made. People can be taught how to do it. It's not impossible. So U.S. Express, first mover on buying large quantities of automatic transmissions. You say?
yeah, big into automatic. They were big into the Eaton-Vorad collision system. My father was always, he was never as an executive. You sort of have one thing you're good at, or most people have like one thing they're really good at. Uh, That's true of my father. His specialty was equipment. He grew up. He when he worked for his father, he was working in the shop. He was doing everything from cleaning out trucks to maintenance. My father knows his way around a truck. Is better probably when he was running his business as good as any executive at a senior level in trucking. That was his thing. His superpower is knowing the truck and knowing all the equipment. And he was always on the sort of bleeding edge of technology. And so anytime an OEM wanted to test everything from, new seats that maybe, Bosch had these new seats that they rolled out a couple years, maybe 20 years ago, that was sort of a new way of handling seats for the driver to automatic transmissions to anti-lock brakes, all the new technologies that sort of go into the fleet. That was my dad's thing. I don't know that he ever actually made sales calls on shippers, but his thing was he knew the intricacies of the truck. He loved the truck. Anytime if I have a maintenance problem with a car or an airplane, whatever, call him up because chances are he's done it before. He's not afraid to get his hands dirty. His fingernails were never clean. Mine were, and that was my dad. And is my dad? He's still around, and he loved drivers. And I know that sounds a little trite because we all know how big fleets treat their drivers at times, but it really he was passionate about the people. When he would walk into a terminal, he spent hours talking to drivers. It was his thing. And he knew the importance of truck drivers. It was something that was sort of in him. It's hard to maintain that relationship when you have so many drivers, and plenty of drivers probably have problems. They've had issues when they worked at US Express, but for him, it was a fundamental belief that the driver is what made the business important.
Right. So just remind me, I need intel for the book. What year did he start buying automatic transmissions?
I don't know that. I have to ask him. I'm going to say the late 80s, maybe early 90s. I'm not sure of the exact date when they did it. They were very early, and they primarily did it. And again, you're gonna have a comment here to attract women. They were a team operation, and they knew that that was at one point 40% of the fleet was teams. and maybe another 20% were trainer fleets. And so if you have teams, the best quality team is a husband wife team,
That's true. Yep.
and because they're married, and there isn't, this is their lifestyle and stuff, and so they found that the best way to attract husband wife teams was to make it comfortable for the wife. I mean, you're married, I'm married. If mama's not happy, you ain't gonna be happy, and especially when you're confounded in a 300 square foot apartment on wheels, right? Probably
Right.
not even.
Yeah. My,
But
my my wife does drive standard, so
well, she's got one up on me on that one, Gord. So,
yeah.
but anyways, that was the reason they put automatic transmissions, because they wanted to attract the female drivers because of their team fleet operations, and I think they were the first fleet in the country to go full automatic. And so that I want to say it was the early '90s, but I'm not sure.
Okay. And later, so you did work for U.S. Express at one
Yeah, I
time?
did it. I was the company's first help desk technician. So I'm a bit of a computer nerd, and I knew how to use Microsoft DOS in those days, and so I would go down and do everything from wiring. I wired we used something called Twinax, which was an AS400, and I wired the corporate headquarters. It was middle of the summer at 110 degrees in southeast Tennessee, going through the attics of insulation. And of course, you're the grunt. I'm a teenage kid, right? And so
Yep,
I'm
that's
I'm
right.
doing a lot of the grunt work. And but I was the company's first help desk technician, and that was where I got my start. I was on the IT side, and then I ended up managing a fleet of drivers as a driver manager. They changed my name to Craig Stevens. So at the first part of the summer, the drivers had no idea who I was. By the end of the summer, they all figured out who I was. And then when I left, I found this out after the fact. They kept my accounts live, and anytime they had a prob, in these AS400 systems, anytime a truck like needed to be worked, something was wrong with the dispatch operation, or the truck had a wrong assignment or something was wrong, they ended up storing all the problem accounts to be dealt with under Stevens. So this Craig Stevens guy eventually had a bad reputation internally for being a really shit driver manager because all the problems were left with him. The first thing they did, I was probably 16, and I remember they gave me a list of drivers, and they went around and asked a bunch of the fleet managers, like, sign this guy 25 drivers. And so I got a combination of some really good drivers, and I got some of them that they all wanted rid of. So I got to sort of see firsthand what it's like being a driver manager, and dealing with drivers firsthand. And then the thing that I loved was doing repowers. And so on college summers and during winter breaks from college, I would come and do repowers, and I loved them because these puzzles of taking. Gord, have you done many repowers in your life? So
I might know it by a different term, so please explain.
So these are repowers in a larger fleet is effectively if a driver breaks down, maybe there's a maintenance issue, perhaps he's out of hours, he's got a medical issue, maybe he just wants to go home, or doesn't want to take a load to say Long Island or something, or Manhattan. They'll do these repowers. They're sort of in transit transfers between trucks, and so the whole game is basically finding a truck, and these two trucks are you don't want to deadhead either truck. So you sort of find one truck that's going down the highway and another truck and trying to get them to transfer in it. And I just thought it was cool because it was just a giant puzzle. And I always liked the ones that were not just one-on-one transfers, but you would go in. And I think one time over the holidays, because U.S. Express had a policy that they would fly a driver home for Christmas. They guaranteed Christmas home, and even if it took an airline ticket. So about mid-December, about December 15th, all of your dispatch operations is all focused on getting drivers home. That is the number one priority. You got freight to run, and some drivers will stay out, and I think they get paid double for staying out or something. But I remember that was sort of so about the 21st of December, the pressure's on because you still got 10% of your fleet. There's no hope of getting them home on a load. So you got to start to put this puzzle together. And I remember one time we had 9 drivers pull into the truck stop, and they all had to switch loads because they're all going different places. And so they were instructed to go into the truck stop, hand their bill of ladens, and then all sort through it. And that was fun. It was kind of a puzzle. And then I did sales. I was a sales rep selling freight. So I wouldn't say I've done everything. I've worked in the parts department. I worked a little bit in maintenance. But I've always loved this business, man.
Right, and it shows you're still in it in a way.
I'm in it. I'm in it. And I will say my father, I idolize my dad. I still do. He's my hero, and I think as someone as any man or boy looks up to their dad, whatever. And I have a close relationship with my father, and so whatever he was interested in, I was interested in, and trucking was his thing, and so he was able to share the stories. He's done it his whole life, and he saw everything from deregulation. He told me all the stories they used to do, all the illegal stuff that they used to do to get away from the regulated market, and
Typed out trip leases, typewriter in the cab of the truck.
all of that. Yeah, exactly. Multiple operating authorities. I think he was 17 years old, and he had a trucking company under his name. And so they had these shipper co-ops in the 70s where they were technically weren't like brokers or fleets, but so he's got all these stories and he imparted that on me.
Right. And those stories of like, you know, to the untrained ear, you know, doing this dodgy stuff, typing out trip leases, trying to keep away from the cops, that was to just affect getting business done.
That was the only way you could do it.
Right. Yeah.
Because and it was the incumbent fleets. Like a lot of people don't realize this, but the ICC was actually set up by the effectively affected by the railroads. I mean, they were the ones who wanted it because they wanted to regulate the truckers. And then the ICC, a lot of what they were trying to protect was the existing incumbent trucking, particularly the LTL players. The LTL guys did, and it was rare. Like Southwest Motor Freight, when it was in regulated market, was a couple hundred trucks, and that was a big fleet. That was about as big as you got, and may have been a top 3 or 5 fleets. My grandfather's company, but you know the LTL guys were the larger fleets. They were the dominant fleets, all unionized. And anytime you wanted to get an operating authority, you had to file with the ICC and you had to describe the commodity and even the shipper to get it. And they would award you a lane, and that was your lane. And the shipper, you had to justify that it made sense to add that lane under your operating authority. And so it's just that the only way to get anything done was to break the rules.
Right. Whereas today, the common breaking the rules we see out there is to avoid accountability for when you've done something wrong, rather than just getting business done.
Yeah, it's in those days it was all about getting business done. It was highly regulated, so the only way to do something was to actually sort of break the rules, if you will. In today's environment, it's the exact opposite because there's absolutely zero regulation. I mean, there are regulations, but there's almost a little enforcement of those regulations. And so now people, it's almost the polar opposite of it. And that's because of the fragmented nature, the number of fleets, and the fact that there's almost no regulations. I mean, there's no enforcement of the regulations means that you end up with this sort of Wild West mentality.
Right. Yeah. And certain actors have taken to that with aplomb. So you're working at U.S. Express. Eventually, you and your family business part ways. When was this?
2005. So from 2002, we had an air freight operation that competed against Forward Air called airport to airport scheduled air freight, but it was all ground. We were running the road feeder service between major airports in the US for expedited ground services. So our customers were the forwarders and the airlines. And uh, I was working the Dallas Fort Worth airport. I'm in my early 20s. And I would get these phone calls from these forwarders and they say, "Hey, Craig, I was the truckload guy because I could call into dispatch and get a truckload." And so they would call me whenever they needed a truck at the airport. And so I started selling these trucks, driving around. And I was had a company car, it was a Chrysler 300, I think is what they called it. Well, it was just like a boat, right?
Yep. Yep.
And I was driving around the DFW airport, and these forwarders would call me late in the afternoon and say, "Hey, I need a truck. I don't care what it costs. Give me a truck." And so after about 6 months of this, and I was making $200, and I would go what I learned is I would get up about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I would do because all my customers were clustered around the DFW airport. These air cargo operations are. And I realized that if all I had to do was go to the bar and open up a tab, and all the forwarders would come over, and we became friends. And so I would do happy hours every single day. My boss would call me at 7 a.m. I was like, if I was answering that call, it's because I'd have been out all night with them. And so about in the afternoon they call, and so over time I started selling all these truckloads, and I was bragging about making $200 in profit. And these guys, dude, like I just made $5,000 on you because they were selling it as air cargo and I was selling it as a truckload. And I was
Wow.
excited to make $200 in profit, and they're excited to make a couple thousand. And I realized that the big asset carriers had missed this opportunity for this sort of on-demand business that existed. And so I went to my dad, and he's like, "Look, I can't help you build this business because I run at this point publicly traded company, but I'll give you a small operation, 4 guys, and if you can figure it out, great." I think he was just patting me on the head. Well, in 2 years, we built that business. It was 140 million in revenue, $68 million in margin. We were doing about $1. Those days, we were 242 a mile, I think, in 2004, and we were paying U.S. Express $1.44 for line haul. So make about $1 a mile, and it was awesome. And what I realized is like every single, even in this market, and I'm talking 2025, there are moments where shippers or forwarders or brokers don't care what it costs to move. And so we had a deal. The corporate executives gave me a deal because I had all these customers that were giving me this freight, and I couldn't get a truck from US Express. And after a while, I just got pissed off, and I was like, dude, I'm getting no support internally. And so the executives, thinking they were stifling me, ended up putting this rule in place that I could have any truck I wanted. I could have as many trucks within 6 hours of 60 US cities. And that became the product. And so we would go in, I mean, you could have Southern California in October, and we had a rule that you could never say no. So nobody inside of our operation could ever turn down a load. The only way you could turn it down was with price. And this was the business I started, and it created so much hate and discontent inside the company that all the executives wanted rid of me. And my brother was one of those people, and we got into a fist fight on the third floor of U.S. Press's operations, and that was when I knew I was done. That was it. And so I left, and we had the air freight business that I helped sell. And then I ended up doing a payments company and left the industry practically altogether. We had fleet cards that we sold to US Bank, and that was sort of my exit out of the trucking industry.
Okay, wow. It came to fisticuffs. That's
Yeah, my dad actually had to go. It was a third floor. US Press has this very large room on the third floor, high ceilings, maybe 20-foot ceilings. Just this big dispatch operation, maybe 300 people in this cube farm work up there. And my brother and I just going at it. And my dad, and I don't know where he showed up. Like, I don't know if he got a phone call, but somehow he just enters this fight and is like pulling us off one another. And that was when it was done. And that was it. That was my tenure at US Express. And I left in 2005, and I was glad to be out of the family business. My brother was definitely on his way to be CEO, and I was glad to be out of it because it was easier to deal with the family dynamics when you have conflict in a business. And anyone who's ever had any, and I have a friend who owns a liquor, his father had a liquor store. He passed away, and it's a small liquor store, in Chattanooga. They fight. The family fights over. So it doesn't matter the size of the business. There's a business, a family business. You're going to have conflict between siblings, and I was just glad to be out of it. And so that was in 2005, and that was sort of I never looked back. Um,
but look where you are now. So
yeah.
tell my listeners a little bit about Sonar and how that got started, what exactly Sonar does, because Sonar then I don't know if it begets FreightWaves or that's what allows you to start FreightWaves.
Yeah. So in 2014, we'd sold our business to US Bank. My dad, we had this payment business, and my dad was sort of the only investor in that business. He ends up firing me in 2014 from that business because when you have a fast growing technology business, it ends up consuming cash. And he didn't want to put more money into it. I wanted to raise money. Anyways, we disagreed and he ended up firing me. He ended up winning that argument. It's his golden rule, they say, right? Whoever has the gold rules, he rules. And he's like, you'll never be, he basically said, don't ever start a business. You should not be a CEO. Like you're not cut out for it. Kind of like a dope dad thing, like, and stuff. And so I went into a pretty dark place because I'm like, look, I've been effectively cut out of the family opportunities. And, when you've sort of had this business in your family, you sort of assume you're always going to have it. And so I'm on the island, if you will. And after a little bit, I got my bootstraps together and I said, all of a sudden there was this emerging tech scene, these venture capital pouring into trucking. And I decided that's what I wanted to do is I wanted to get back into the industry and I was doing some day trading on the side, not successfully, actually very unsuccessfully. And kept listening to CNBC talk about the economy, but they'd never talk about trucking as a barometer for it. They always talked about ocean shipping, but never talked about trucking. And I had this idea that I wanted to go start a business that basically, and I use Bloomberg as the analogy or CNBC as an analogy, but for trucking. And that was sort of the initial idea. And so we started FreightWaves. The initial idea was basically a data business and a tradable instrument called a futures contract. Anybody who's done any kind of commodities probably knows what a future contract is. But anyways, the idea is that we're going to have this data business. And as we started to go out and talk to people, I couldn't get any of the media to pick up on it. None of the incumbent media like Transport Topics or CCJ or any of these incumbent players would even talk about what we were doing. And so we ended up hiring a reporter. We put out a job posting to do social media posts, and it was a reporter by the name of Brian Strait who had worked at Fleet Owner Magazine. And I hired him, and I was like, "Look, I need you to talk about the economy, the freight market." And he's like, "Well, nobody reads this stuff." And I was like, "That's what I want you to talk about." And so that was how FreightWaves got started. Is that we were, a lot of the incumbent media businesses would talk about the freight market, if there was a earnings release or about freight rates a month after they had this print cycle. So they would talk about it a month after something happened, whereas people really wanted this real-time information. And I think the reason we're successful is because freight brokers had become such a big player in the market and they day trade this stuff, right? And they forced drivers to day trade it. And we were sort of benefiting and maybe in some ways accelerating or causing this volatility of the market by just being more real time. And that's really our role is like a real time information business for the trucking industry. And that's what we've grown. That's been our mission. That's what we've done.
Yeah, I know, and you've had some pretty good employees over the years. Reporting on that, specifically Ms. Rachel Premack.
Love Rachel. She was when I first came across Rachel, I think she was at Business Insider in her first early days. And she had backlinked one of our articles. She had written a story about trucking, and she always did it from the sort of driver. She was always a labor. That's where she started doing labor reporting, and I think she was always intrigued by the plight of the individual, like whether it was the individual truck driver and the sort of predatory practices. And I think that was always one of her favorite sort of topics. But she had a way, and she still does, even though she's not reporting anymore, of sort of captivating the story. The way she would write a story was just she could tell you could empathize with the story. It was not formulaic a way a lot of people write. It was very sort of story driven and so she ended up, after, 3 or 4 years of writing for Insider, ended up coming to work for FreightWaves because she loved the trucking business so much. I think what happened is Insider actually moved her to report on, I think she did broke a story at one of the big media companies, Condé Nast, and ended up getting an editor fired over one of her stories. And I think at some point there was a conversation about her being nominated for the Pulitzer. But that wasn't good enough. She wanted to get back into trucking, and I thought that was pretty interesting. And Insider, they definitely have clean fingernails. Thought that trucking was it was too blue collar for them, and so
There's a lot of that.
What's that?
Like there's a lot of that out there in the
A
sort of
lot of it.
normal mainstream media.
Yeah, the
Me,
only time they report on it is when something's broken or when they have some type of, real sensational story about the business. And so she joined us for a couple of years, and then she ended up getting a job at a hedge fund. And she's super excited about that. Frankly, making a lot more money than a journalist ever will. And I will say this, we've had the fortunate opportunity of having a lot of people who have come work at FreightWaves and then have gone on and done some great things in the industry. And I'm proud of that, is that, and I tell people when they come here, you may not stay forever, you may not. And hopefully if you don't, then there's better opportunities out there for you.
yeah, no, I've relied heavily on your guys' work. I cite it in my own just because the reporting's been so good. Like Rachel and Clarissa Haas and Grace, you've had a really good crew over there, and I appreciate that you've let them go right, dig up all the dirt, write the stuff. Um, One of the things, and I've mentioned this in a few places now, and it's going to be in the book. Uh, you have a whole section of FreightWaves website that's called layoffs and bankruptcies.
Unfortunate, right?
Yeah,
It's
it's very
insane that you have to
unfortunate.
do that. It's insane that you have a whole section for it. I mean, there is a bank. So my wife, she went to college. She went to University of Alabama. She's from New Jersey, but she wanted to go to an SEC school because the quality of life is better, I think, for even people from New Jersey. And um, one of her college, I think sorority sisters or somebody she knew in college told her her family has a distressed, they buy distressed paper from banks, basically. And the first place they go to, because they're looking for bankruptcy filings and information, the first place they go to, they're not even in trucking, is freightways.com because we have the most extensive bankruptcy reporting of any media business in any topic. And I don't think it's look, I think our reporters do a great job covering bankruptcies, but I think it's more of a testament to the problems of this industry.
Well, yeah,
It has
I was
anything to
gonna get to
do
that. Yeah.
it has anything to do with our reporting. I We certainly understand the importance of it, but it also is I think is a more damning fact, the fact that there is so much bankruptcies in trucking. Like it is a core piece of the business. Unfortunately, it's just structurally built into the model.
Okay, and that begets a question about the Great Freight Recession. And there's been much sturm and drang about whether or not that's over and speculation about where it's going.
Gord, I'm not going to say anything because at the moment I say it's over,
Oh
I'm
no,
going to
I'm
be
not going to
wrong
ask you
about
that.
it.
No, no, no. I know. I'm not.
You'd be perfectly. I would not be offended if you did. So
I am not going to put you on the spot in that way, sir. What I do want to do though is discuss a little bit of the history of this, like recently, because like you're the guy, right? Like you have this sonar which we haven't got to yet, but the Great Freight Recession sort of starts. I want to say 2022 after the COVID demand spike subsides.
yeah, it was May. It was March of 2022 when we first started. That was our first report. Was the basically a fresh. I think the headline was the a freight recession is imminent, and that was the headline. So
Right, and then it happened.
it happened. Oh, there was a period of time for about 6 months, even 9 months, where there was a lot of vitriol because people either didn't believe it, didn't want to believe it, or thought we were somehow manipulating the market, which is always a surprising thing. You're like, I wish I had that power to actually be able to have that kind of influence. But the reality is, like, it went on for at least 9 months before I think the broader market sort of felt the pain, and then we've been in it, since for 3 years now. So.
Right. So there are some critics out there who, my friends, I'll shout out Shannon at American Truckers United, who postulate that part of the story with the Great Freight Recession is that we also have this capacity glut and that
I,
there's just way too many trucks out there, too many drivers, too many companies. And that's why freight rates have sort of been holding steady where they are. What do you have to say to that?
I agree 100%. I think they're absolutely correct that the problem has been capacity. That has actually been we have been consistent about the fact that it's been capacity. I will say credit to what they identified. We were late to identify, or at least realize that they were correct. Is they were talking about labor dumping and this concept, and I know you've covered it extensively. It's this concept of basically people who don't have work permits or people who are illegal working in the United States and taking trucking jobs that shouldn't be taking any kind of job. And I think when they were talking about it, at first I kind of ignored it because they were on X, and it was like everything we would say, they would respond was labor dumping, whatever. And I tend to be pretty empathetic towards just anybody who's trying to make a living, regardless of their background. I was married once to a Colombian. I have a son who's Latino, who's half Latino. He's been in the U.S. his whole life. He's from here. But I befriended a lot of Colombians and Latinos in college and afterwards, and I will say they're some of the hardest working people. And some of the stories of what they did to come across to the U.S. for leaving some of these war-torn areas of the world, in Colombia specifically, was in a civil war, and some of the sacrifices they made to get here, you can't help but have empathy for them. I think in many ways that blinded me to their story and thinking that I don't know if this is true, and maybe this is my own bias at the time when they were talking about it, of just being blinded to the fact that this is not driven by xenophobia. It's driven by the fact that this is a fundamental problem. And I think for probably, I don't know if it's a year, or at least 6 months, I kind of ignored their stories because I just felt that it wasn't as sincere. And as I dug into the problem, as we dug into it, and it was no longer just them talking about it, but you're starting to get a lot more information. I owe them an apology because I largely ignored it. I thought it was just nothing more than xenophobia. But what they've been able to prove is how big of an issue this is. And I think part of it is that this is a relatively recent problem. The level of the amount of labor in trucking that are people who don't have work permits, who can't speak English, who are not qualified to drive trucks, is a relatively the scale of the problem is a relatively recent problem, and it's really exacerbated since COVID. And I think what's happened is a lot of these fleet operators, as the market went down, as rates went down, and freight dried up, as a way to stay in business, started to look at that population as a way to sort of survive, and like cockroaches. So they were paying people below living wages, what would be a living wage for an American, and were able to sort of exploit the folks here just trying to stay here and find work, and we're taking advantage of the fact that the Biden administration didn't care.
Well, I'm writing a very lengthy chapter about what went on south of this trucking task force. And one of the things I noticed, and I'm going to add another anecdote to this, and I want to get your insight into this because you come from the sort of management side of things. So this trucking task force happens, under the Biden administration. They all want to figure out how to deal with the COVID demand spike and make sure the supply chains work. And their intentions were maybe pure at the beginning,
But
and
they're kind of morons, Gord, real quick.
they
I
are.
met them.
They are.
They're all
Okay.
McKinsey. They're like, I've been doing this for a month. I'm like, well, you guys are supposed to be the
Well,
guys.
okay, but they were asking the guys that no, right? So they've got David Carell, who's this guy from MIT Freight Labs that is sort of the kingpin of studying the detention problem. I recorded a podcast with him 2 weeks ago. I'll be releasing it shortly. And Carell and his team show all this data to Biden saying, look, you got enough trucks. You just have to keep them moving.
Mm-hmm.
You guys, there's something about the industry that's not keeping them moving, which is the detention issue. It's been around forever, as you know. They had testimony from Michael Belzer, Steve Shelley, all these guys are telling Biden, look, you don't necessarily need more truck drivers. You just have to use the ones you've got more effectively, pay them better, figure things out at the facilities they interact with, and these problems will solve themselves. Biden administration ignored all of that expert testimony and then started doing this thing that Shannon and his guys have identified where they're working with certain states to lower CDL requirements, and all that stuff goes on. I just had a conversation with a woman in Toronto who runs a truck driving school there. And she called me the other day and she's like, you're not going to believe this. One of the head of department for Loblaws, which is this sort of institutional grocery store chain in Canada. They're part of the Weston Group. Galen Weston and his family are like one of the 500 families of the Laurentian elite. They own a number of different grocery store brands and other retail brands. Massive, massive, huge, multi-billion-dollar company. Their freight buy every year is astronomical. All the refrigerated stuff, produce going to Canada, they're all over it. So they hire this new guy to manage their freight stuff and the sort of HR within that, but he doesn't know anything about trucking. So this guy goes to my friend's truck driving school, sits with one of his assistants, sits down with my friend and says, I've been hearing this stuff about President Trump in the United States and this English proficiency thing, and we're not sure how it's going to affect us. And like, what can you tell us we can do to like make sure we've still got drivers? Like this guy got hired to manage the logistics operation for one of the biggest companies in Canada. No idea how trucking works. How often does this happen?
Oh, all the time. I mean that I do. I think that's the problem. Is like because like here's the thing: is how often I saw it at US Press. I mean, the reason US Press isn't an independent fleet; it's owned by Knight Swift now, is because my brother hired a lot of people who didn't come from the industry, thinking my dad's. And there's this video he did a couple of years ago where it started this thing called Variant, and the guy ran a brokerage. He was a CTO at Coyote, who ended up getting that U.S. Express, and then my brother basically goes on this conversation about how I'm paraphrasing that the people that work for my father were a bunch of bozos. Now, U.S. Express was a very successful business up until the end, and it only lost money 1 year out of the entire history it was in business. And my brother cycled out all of those people, and because he brought in some really, really, really smart people with PhDs and masters and MBAs, and it was an executive that worked at Whirlpool. I think it was the CMO of Whirlpool. Very accomplished people, but they knew jack about trucking. And in doing that, it broke U.S. Express because they didn't understand their things about trucking. And I think when the Biden task force, I talked to the White House task force, the guy that I
Oh,
spoke,
you did too?
I did too.
Oh, wow. All right.
That's why I said they're morons, because they were like when I say they're McKinsey consultants, I'm being sincere. They were McKinsey consultants, and they had been doing it a month, and I remember we talked to them. It was right about the time, it's 2022, when I was speaking with them about ocean freight. This was in the summer of 22, and we had written a story about the collapse in imports. And it was still controversial in those at that moment. That did end up happening. And they just didn't believe, they didn't understand it. And they couldn't even provide any kind of, and I asked them, I was like, how long have you guys been doing this? They're like, oh, we're doing it a month. We're learning about supply chain. And I'm like, you're advising. They're like, well, we came from McKinsey. Because think about who was the OG McKinsey guy in the Biden administration. It was Buttigieg. So like Mayor Pete was a McKinsey consultant. He became mayor. Then he ran for president because he sort of fit the brand. Like he's an articulate guy. He's impressive on TV. He does a very good job on TV. But he's running the Department of Transportation. And so naturally, if you're the Biden administration, you go to DOT and you say, how do you know? They say, well, bring in McKinsey. Because McKinsey knows all sorts of things about freight, right? No, not, I'm being facetious. Those guys knew nothing. They had been doing it a month when I spoke with them. And they're responsible for advising the administration on what we're supposed to be doing. Now,
Wow.
I will say, in fairness, I give the Biden administration at least a C grade for trying, because a lot of the other administrations don't even start. So they get a grade for trying, but the people they hire were morons.
Right. Okay. And I want to make sure we're not partisan here. I'm an equal opportunity attacker of politicians. I think the Republicans, at least like some of the Congress critters, senators, and state level people are all likewise clueless.
Well, most people are.
We see constant calls, driver shortage, we need more money, we need more truckers. Quite often the people saying this have an R beside their name, and they're just listening to some of the other corporate truckers
So,
and the
Gordon, I
AT
will say
people.
this: as someone who grew up in big trucking, I heard about the driver shortage my whole life. In fact, I remember when we started covering the driver shortage story at FreightWaves, I remember some of our journalists, and maybe pre Rachel had been here, or maybe hadn't been here at this point, but I remember some of them were pushing back, and they were. I was like, look, there's a driver shortage. A driver shortage. It's 2017, 18. And they would go, man, there's no driver shortage. And they would have kept, and it took me probably a year to deinstitutionalize my sort of big trucking pedigree. And I think what happens in these big trucking operations is they don't ask the right questions. No one has challenged the ATA. If you think about it, Transport Topics is owned by the American Truckers Association.
That's right. Yeah, just like ATRI is as well.
ATRI is owned by the ATA, and these are arguably the most influential before we came along and of course there's a bunch of trucking blogs and other media sites for truck drivers. But in terms of the audience that the ATA cares about is big fleet executives and Congress. That's what it is.
Yep. Yep.
There was no other media business that was covering trucking to that audience before we came along. So the only narrative that actually got out there was the one from the ATA because they were able, and I believed it. I was institutionalized that the driver shortage was real. That is no longer the case. So we started challenging it. I've gotten a lot of heat from it, from the ATA. I think largely because I've sort of abandoned the groupthink and have sort of if someone who came as sort of one of their own, if you will, has started to really challenge them. I think it's become personal for them.
Yeah, well, I mean, they famously, you offered them a $50,000 donation to a charity of their choice to engage in a debate at one of your events.
Bloomberg offered to host it. Odd Lots, Joe Weisenthal, which I know you know, and you've been on his podcast.
Shout out, Joe.
Offered to actually referee, become a legitimate, offer a platform on Bloomberg, which there's no bigger platform for that specific audience. And they have not taken me up on it. And look, they could $50,000 can go to an ATRI. It can go into some. I'm sure they have some cause they care about. I think for me, I just want them to come if they truly believe that there is a driver shortage, and they have the opportunity to state their case. That is also challenged. I'd like for them to argue it.
Yeah, no, me too. I'd love to hear it. I mean, I've sort of been doing my own research for the book, and the first time that the ATA began to really push this idea of a shortage of drivers is in 1987. So when you've been playing the same tune for 38 years, it's a little hard to change the record. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think in the early days, and I remember getting a lot of heat when we first started coming out with some of our reporting. So when we started talking about the freight market collapse and the 2019 recession, a lot of the tension came about because the larger truckload carriers had convinced themselves that the shippers were not aware of freight softness. And they had convinced themselves that we, being FreightWaves, talking about the freight market and where the freight market is at, meant that shippers all of a sudden were empowered to know where the market's at. And they were afraid this was going to be used against them. And I think that's where a lot of that driver shortage narrative really took hold among the carriers, was that they could go to the shippers and tell them, hey, we have to raise rates for pay for drivers, and there's a driver shortage, and convince shippers that, and this is how they got a lot of the big fleet executives on their side, was that this is a way to pass on rate increases to shippers, that shippers would not be informed of what's happened in the market. Likewise, ATA, through its public policy and lobbyist group, needs to convince Congress to create rules and financial incentives and appropriations to basically create these diploma mills, and you've been very public about this, to bring new entrants into the industry, and that's really the whole purpose of that driver shortage narrative. And the unfortunate thing is, a lot of major media, and what was so unique about Rachel is she worked for a mainstream media business and was one of the only people who actually dug into the industry to understand it, and still worked at she could have reported on anything. I mean, that was a great thing working for.
I was one of those people that emailed her, right? So she does her very first article at Business Insider on trucking, and she's spoken about this, that it like got her in trouble with people like me. She had her email address at the bottom. I'm like, sweet, I'm going to talk to this lady. And I was apparently one of hundreds of people that emailed her. And then she kept digging.
Yep.
She did the, journalistic integrity thing of like following the truth wherever it
Hmm.
led her, and good for her. So speaking of researching my book, I know you have to go soon. You, sir, are also writing a book.
I am. I just finished it. So mine started in 2021, Gord.
Oh, you've been working on it for
21.
four years.
It is
Oh,
literally writing your first book is a painful. I did it during
whoa.
COVID. I did a lot of projects during COVID that I ended up regretting doing. But the book started in 21, and I finally finished it. So I don't know if it's going to be. I've gone through multiple iterations of it. I would say that I um I'm proud of how it's ended up, although it's been very painful. So
And so, what's the sort of subject? What's the arc? What's the narrative? What exactly are you talking
yeah,
about in it?
it's more of just a history of supply. There's not a lot of supply chain narratives about the history of how we got here and sort of the context of all the things that if you knew nothing about freight and about how supply chains work is really it's sort of a it's meant to do that. The big container book by Mark Levin is probably as close as a mainstream book. This is written for a mainstream audience that knows nothing about freight. It's sort of understanding the intricacies of how we got here, everything from how the railroads were built, the ICC, FedEx. I spent a lot of time on the history of FedEx, DHL, and UPS. A lot of talking about the container lines and some of the more exploitive practices that they've done. I certainly talk about trucking. I do talk about labor dumping and the immigration issue, but I'm not going in deep on any specific topic. It's meant to be broad base for someone who knows nothing about freight and just trying to learn it. I think daily I get inbound inquiries either on X or on LinkedIn or emails of someone who's just joined the industry who knows nothing about it and like, what do I read? And there's not a lot of books to recommend. Like for someone who knows that's working in the industry that wants to understand how did we get here and how does it work, there aren't a lot of books that do that. And I'm
Yeah.
not, you're doing a deep investigative piece, I think.
Well, so the publishers. So my book was not my idea, right? I was approached by some guys, and I think they're clued into what you're saying now about the fact that there's nobody talking about all this critical part of like how modern civilization works, right? Like
Yep.
global supply chains, ocean lines, freight. So this publishing company that approached me, they were reading my Substack, and they're like, A, there's not very many books on trucking to begin with,
Right.
and B, there's not very many of them from a truck driver, and C, like you spit a lot of fire on your Substack, and we think we can like form this into something that people will like to read. So will you write a book for us? And that was in November. So you got like a 3.5 year head start on me. My book will have been written in the course of about 9 months.
That's amazing. You're going to have more. I'm sure you're going deeper on these topics than I have been. So the good
I
news
don't.
is, Gord, when you look at the category, there's like, well, probably the only two books published this year on entire freight because there just isn't a lot of it. So
Right. When does yours come out?
we're going to have it out in October. So we're actually going to have it for F3.
Oh, very good.
So that is our goal. I have a publishing business, believe it or not, that's tied to our railroad. We own some railroad magazines, and we actually have a book publishing business. So we're going to do it through that. Where it's not, I'm not going the main route. I got talked into very similar to you. I got talked in 2021 to do a book. And regretted for many long days agreeing to do it. The problem is like
I hear
anything,
that.
you're in the middle of it and you're like, okay, just got to finish it. So
Yeah, that's
it
where
is.
I'm at. Yeah.
The good news is that it's so much easier to do research now, and even like copy editing because of all these language learning models. I make it so much better to get to do it than when I first started it. So I had a human editor. It's gone through three different human editors that have helped me put it together. But I mean, it was quite painful because I was doing other stuff and trying to write this book. That's why it took 4 years. So
Wow. Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, look at the empire you're running. You got Firecrown. You got Sonar. FreightWaves. Quickly before you go, I've mentioned Sonar now twice to people who don't know what's Sonar.
So it's a data. Think of it as a data platform for freight. If you know what a Bloomberg terminal, what a Bloomberg terminal is in financial markets and in stock markets or commodity markets, that's what Sonar is meant to be for freight. It's meant to pull in all of the major data points across all modes of traffic. So everything from trucking to rail to ocean freight, and really put it into a single dashboard, that a single platform that people can see what's happening in a real time basis. So our goal is to have the data sets that explain what's happening, and it's they're really there's a lot of data products out there in freight. You get freight rate products that are out there, but this is the only platform that brings it all together in a comprehensive package. And it's all focused on high frequency data, which is really data that's within the last 24 hours of what's happening. And I think that's what has made it special.
Right. And you have how many subscribers does Sonar have? Do you know roughly?
So corporate, we have about 400 plus corporates, but these are typically large companies. So we don't it's a pretty expensive product. The average is $48,000 is what we charge on average for clients. But you get typically, it's surprising when we get a small trucker or broker buys it. It's only surprising because it's almost what most companies need, or what most players need, is they need a knife. And this is an Uzi, or this is a Moab, the mother of all bombs, versus a knife. For most people, if I was a single truck operator, there's I could have a rate product like DAT or truck stop that would be sufficient. We're rolling out a really cheap product that takes the sonar data but brings a very small segment of that. Just the rate data is all they need. All I need as a trucker is rate data and market conditions and knowing where to put my truck. And we'll be rolling out something that's $10 a month starting in July. And that will strip out the majority of the sonar data because, frankly, it's way too much data for a small operator. And frankly, the product itself is way too complicated for that operator. And so we're going to do something that takes that data and sort of democratizes it. But right now, it's meant to be sort of the larger players in the market to sort of have it. It's not because we want them to necessarily have an edge. It's more because the data is it's so much investment that's gone in it. It's hard to make money on a lot of individual players, and the product itself is too complicated. The UI is too difficult to navigate unless you have somebody that does it full time. And so we're trying to make it very easy for a small operator. So we'll have a mobile app, $10 a month, and then hopefully the smallest operators will have the same data that the big players do without the noise that's built into it.
All this Trump executive order English proficiency stuff. How much? What's the word here? How much interest has that generated, like amongst yourself and FreightWaves staff? Like, how many people are asking you guys about it? Like what's the sort of
Not
buzz?
enough. I think it's an underreported story. I think it's an underappreciated story. It is, if you go on to X, everyone's talking about it, right? And I think, frankly, um, because the actual change in policy, or the awareness, if you will, um, by the DOT head actually started apparently from X. So a couple of those accounts that made it very apparent that this is a problem. I think that's why it's on X. But if you go out to the broader sort of trucking population, particularly people that are in the shipper community or even large brokers, I don't think they're talking about it enough. I don't think it's on. I think the problem that you have, Gord, is that so many things in history. It was the ELD mandate, and then it was the drug and alcohol clearinghouse, and it was so all these rules that everyone's convinced is going to get rid of this capacity, and it never leaves. And I think there's the same view about this English proficiency mandate, that it's just one more thing that the government's never going to do anything about. And I think that's the perception that a lot of people have. I actually think this is different because this is actually a labor related decision that has nothing to do with trucking specifically. I mean, yes, it's specifically on trucking, but it has to do with the labor pool. And I think the industry has a big demographic problem. You've talked about it. There's not enough young people going into trucking jobs. And so there, if you eliminate a large portion or a significant portion of the population, you're going to have a capacity shortage. And I think, frankly,
But we have been over capacity though. So is this
we're
going to
way
be
over. But
is it going to
remember,
create a shortage, or is it just going to rebalance things?
I think we're already close to balance. I mean, a 6% rejection rate would suggest that we're pretty close to being balanced anyways. And so, in fact, you can look at volumes. Volumes are anemic this year. It's been a tough year. If you looked at it only on a volume basis, trucking's not doing so great. But it's not as bad as it has been because the rejection rates are much higher. Rates have sort of stayed steady. The level of pain that's in the industry it's not great, but it's a lot less than it was 2 years ago. And I think what's happening is that a lot of capacity has left the market. And I think this is just enough. There's a reporter we have at FreightWaves. His name is John Kingston.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
familiar. Yep.
Comes from the oil business. And so, in fact, OPEC, which is the cartel of oil countries, he was an oil reporter and reported on commodity markets. As you know, oil is the biggest commodity market in the planet. And he always likes to say it's the incremental barrel of oil that sets the price. It's not the percentage that sets the price. It's that incremental barrel. And what he means by that is all of the price discovery isn't over the fact that we're 10 or 20%. The markets are relatively efficient and relatively balanced. But when you have an incremental, either piece of demand or supply, the market is going to clear at whatever the market clears at. And so that incremental, it doesn't take much when you have a market like we have in trucking. It doesn't take a ton, as balanced as we believe it is. It doesn't take a lot to sort of tip it over. And so you could have what we call a short squeeze. If you look at commodity markets, people talk about a short squeeze, which is when everyone's basically trying to cover we very well could be in a situation where we have just enough demand and a significant drop of supply, and shippers need to move their freight at any cost that could cause us to have effectively a short squeeze. In fact, when I was studying to build FreightWaves, I studied a lot of commodity markets. And one of the things that's very surprising is that commodity markets have a tendency to actually accelerate faster. The risk is actually on the upside, not the downside. Is they move much faster on the upside and much slower on the downside. And I thought that was really interesting. And look, by all definitions, freight's a commodity. We could be in a situation where things get really tight and we could see a hyperbolic change in freight rates. And so that's what I think could happen. Again, I hate to say that because someone's going to say, you caught it again. But the reality is we could be in a situation where I think if we have enough demand that keeps the market whole and we see this enforcement thing actually take hold in the market, we could be in a pretty interesting market this year.
All right. Do you guys track Canadian freight at all?
We do have on our tender data, we have some Canadian freight, and on rates, we have Canadian freight, but we're certainly not that deep in Canada. A lot of it's cross border, but I couldn't give you a perspective on the Canadian. I'd be making it up. So, but
Right,
I
yeah.
mean, the one thing about Canada that I do know, and you know this market better, much better than I do, is a lot of it's commodity driven. So the trucking market up there is far more tied to the commodity markets than we are here in the States, because you just that's what drives the Canadian economy.
Yeah. It's resource extractive, big projects. A friend of mine is a freight agent for a large company who shall remain nameless. We spoke the other day, and he said it's just dead out there. He's getting lists
Mm.
from carriers every day. Everyone's begging for work. Nobody questions rates. Just we got trucks sitting all over the place. Same lady in Toronto. A number of her associates are reporting anecdotally, oh, hey, you drive around Toronto and it seems like half to 60, 70% of the trucks are gone.
Wow.
There's just nothing
What is it? What
happening.
is what did you guys did you experience that last couple of years, or is it different?
It's been sort of slowly and steadily getting worse and worse.
Got it.
I think, I don't know that the change to the Trump administration or the tariffs have done much about this. This is my own biased opinion. the Canadian government leadership's left a lot to be desired in the past decade. And again, commodity driven. Alberta is the engine that keeps the rest of the country going, and just Trudeau's intransigence with oil development, and just no more rail lines, no more pipelines, no way to get the stuff out. It's just slowed things down considerably. And then there's labor problems, there's tax problems, there's interprovincial trade problems. Like the joint's just a mess.
It's going to be interesting how our grandkids perceive this time in history and look about how stupid some of the policy decisions, like what Germany did to its nuclear. I mean, the nuclear as a energy source, or even fossil fuels, like what you guys have done in Canada and what has been done in the U.S. around fossil fuels has been a travesty. I mean, all of this energy that we need, and I think that's been the thing that is we are seeing is sort of this awareness of how important energy is. And I think that's the better news about what's happening.
Right. Yeah. Well, people are getting wise to what's going on, and you and I spend an awful lot of time on Twitter, and, for good or for ill, it's a great place to find information. And, I will discuss some of these issues in real life with people, and they don't know, or they think I'm making it up. And, oh, I have to go check that out. I'm like, oh,
Gordon, it happens to me every day because you talk about even people who I consider well informed are like, why hasn't anyone talked? So there's a conversation I had not too long ago with a friend of mine who's very well informed. He's in freight, and he's a well-known analyst. And I was talking about China and the geopolitical national security things going on with China and the U.S. And he's like, why is anyone talking about this? Because like I was making the case that a lot of the tariff issue is as much about national security as is it. And he's like, I don't know that that's right. And I'm start bringing up these points. And he's like, why is anyone talking about it? I'm like, dude, you should get on X. like a minute. And I remember when we had the supply chain crisis back in 2021 when I was building a house and we had an architect, and the architect was talking about delays on windows, and he's like, man, nobody's talking about this stuff. And I'm like, dude, you're in the wrong place. But I think most people are just ignorant to these topics. On X, we feel overinformed, right?
Yeah. Oh, it's a firehouse. I had to step back for a few weeks so I could keep my brain going.
Finish your book.
Yeah.
So when is your book coming out?
In time for Matt's. I want to be able to go and sell it at Matt's. So
what, next year, you mean?
Yeah, March. Yeah, I'll be out in March. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to do a pre-read, so we'll.
Yeah, I'll send you the manuscript when it's done. Manuscript's supposed to be done by the end of August.
Perfect. Well, good luck. I know
I'll get you to do one of the little scribbles on the back.
I'll do a pre-read and a preview. So,
all right. Well, hey, Craig Fuller, thanks very much for joining the show. How can people find you?
Yeah, at Freight Alley on X.
On X and FreightWaves.com.
FreightWaves.com. If you're looking for information about freight, that's where we're at. So,
all right. Well, thanks very much, sir, and way of the road.